Chapter 2 of Murder in the Sacristy by Daniel A. Lord, S.J. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 2. We stood, the lot of us, facing Father Tierney with something close to horror on our faces. I could see the web of circumstantial evidence that already was fastening around him. He was a poor young priest, the custodian of jewels that he would some day have to relinquish. He was the only one who had a key for that rear sacristy door, through which the murderer had clearly passed. His beretta had been crushed by the falling body of the Russian sacristan, who had evidently interrupted the thief removing the precious stones. Yet it was also absurd. Carl and I looked at each other, and except for the stark horror of the moment, I could see that Carl wanted to laugh at the whole absurdity of the thing. But before I go on, it is only decent to explain how an Irish-American boy, an American of German extraction, and a Polish singer should have been thrown together in the setting of a Greek Uniate church. And that necessitates a brief journey that takes us back to the deck of an ocean liner bound from Havre to New York. I had finished my musical training in the Paris Conservatory. Nature, and God, if you want to use the term, had given me a better than ordinary baritone voice. An opportunity had made possible a year of training under the great singing teachers that gather in Paris the way brokers gather in Wall Street. On the ship coming back with me was Karl Reinhardt, who, though we had never met, had been studying piano and composition for 3 years in Paris, played marvellously, and ran off for me a few little things of his own that some day the better type records will be offering to collectors, and that great conductors will gladly include in their programs. We had been swimming in the ship's pool, and were tossing the ring across the deck tennis net, when we noticed a young fellow come out, slip off a dressing gown, dive neatly into the pool, swim across its narrow width with 2 powerful strokes, laze about in the water, and then climb out to watch us with a friendly grin. We, with the careless camaraderie of shipboard, invited him into the game. And to our amazement he beat us each individually, and then took us both on and trimmed the 2 of us together. It wasn't until that evening, when he appeared in the dining salon, wearing a Roman collar, that I knew he was a priest. And it wasn't until we had come to be good friends that he told us the really interesting things about himself, that he was a Brooklyn lad who had volunteered for the Russian mission, that he had completed his seminary days and been ordained at the Pope's own Russian college in Rome, and that, until the day came when he could slip past the guards who turned back all priests from Russian soil, he had accepted the opportunity of working among the Russians and Greeks of Chicago. That will make me letter perfect in the ritual and the language, and if you think it doesn't take a bit of wrestling to get my Irish tongue around that language and those tunes, you have 3 more guesses coming. But one of these days," he added, and there was a light in his eyes as he said it, "I'll be getting into Russia, and helping to bring back the Church and Christ to that sad, sad land." He was a persuasive chap, no doubt of that, and though I am not, as I've said, a Catholic, and Karl, during his days in Paris, hadn't spent too much time on his knees, that young Irish, Russian, Greek persuaded us to help him out with his new parish. So Karl agreed to play the organ for him. Truth to tell, I think he was delighted with the chance to soak up that marvellous musical ocean that is the Greek liturgy. And the first thing I knew, I said I'd sing for him, being the only member of his choir. If we thought that was all we'd have to do for Father Mart, we were badly fooled. He dragged us around Chicago until we located this little Protestant church, which was standing idle and going to decay on the west side's polyglot, Blue Island Avenue. Once it had served as a sort of chapel for the Halsted Social Center down the street, but since the Italians didn't take much to Protestant services, and the clinic at the center cut down the population, and its own clientele, by generous lessons in birth control, the chapel had fallen into disuse. So Father Mart had the 2 of us wangling real estate agents to let him have it for nothing down and a little each year. The miracle is that he got it, and faced the future of his as yet non-existent congregation with absolute confidence. "They'll come," he bragged happily, while with my magnificent basso in the Mass, Karl's handling of that wheezy box he calls his organ, and Pierre's bountiful baritone, we'll have them hanging from the rafters, if we ever happen to have rafters. Ivan Ratoff he had picked up at the House of Hospitality of the Catholic workers down the street. He chose him simply because he was a Russian, looked hungry, and talked himself eloquently into the job of sacristan and janitor. Personally, I think Radolph had never had a broom in his hand, and I saw him use the claw end of a hammer to drive a nail. But Father Mart swore by his find, and bragged that he probably was a great nobleman. "We may not have much of an edifice," he said, "but it's something to have a janitor who once, I'm sure of it, held the imperial boot tree for Tsar Nicholas of all the Russias. Not that Ivan ever proclaimed to be anything more than the bum Karl and I pronounced him, but it was Father Mart's pet joke, and we let it go at that. The jewels, well, for some reason he had told Karl about them. I'm not going to be jealous over the fact that he kept them a secret from me. It was clear that he liked Karl the better of the two of us, which seemed natural enough, since Karl was a charming fellow, and a Catholic to boot, and few people would class me as either. So that explains how we stood there in a sudden realization that we had to line up shoulder to shoulder in the face of his horrible crime. Suspicion had fallen like the blow of a heavy hand on the shoulder of our young priest friend. I'll say this for Sergeant Riley, I've never seen a police officer that had a clue right in his hands who looked unhappier than he did. He turned that funny-shaped beretta over and over in his fingers, and said not a word. Finally, drawing himself together with visible effort, he held it out toward the priest. "This, Father," he said, and all his Catholic instincts resented the question he had asked, "is obviously yours." The priest nodded dumbly. "Well, I thought, innocent men usually look most guilty. They have no prepared alibis, no glib explanations." "Can you explain how it happened to be on the floor, under the body of the murdered man?" Father Mart shook his head. "I'm a pretty careless sort of fellow, Sergeant," he said, his face alternately pale as death and flushed with a guilty colour. "But I know positively I've never worn that into the church. I hate anything on my head. The sisters keep a beretta for me in their chapel. I'd almost forgotten I had another one." "But you did have one," said the police officer. "And this is yours?" He nodded sadly. Then across the silence cut the sudden sound of men's voices in song. I remember that the music came with a kind of savage beauty. Rugged, untrained voices shot through with emotional depth and the white heat of fierce passion. It wasn't like the music of some college glee club or a mere choral society that was practicing a favourite quartet arrangement. It was set to the tempo of boots beating on a military road. It was fierce with the lust for battle. You expected at any moment to hear a deep chord blown apart with a sudden explosion of heavy artillery. Sergeant Riley swore quietly and eloquently, and then looked embarrassed. "Sorry, Father," he apologized, "but whenever I hear the singing of that swastika bund, or come near anything else that they do—" He strode to the sacristy's little window and threw it open. The volume of sound rose perceptibly. The voices came clearer now, and the words were German. I recognized the song. It was the marching song of Hitler Youth, and I had heard it and hated it the preceding summer when I had travelled as a tourist in Germany and watched the regimentation of a nation. A people that sang from their love of music changed to a race that sang from their hatred of the enemies, a hatred built up into synthetic wrath. To the south side of the little chapel stood a public hall that constantly saw on successive nights meeting of social clubs, amateur boxing matches, receptions for young Jewish brides, Greek birthday parties, Italian christening festivities, and now this meeting of the swastika bund. Riley stood glaring up at the lighted windows. I tugged Karl's arm, and said, in a voice that I meant should reach Riley's ears, "Wouldn't they have loved to lay their hands on Russian jewels? Wouldn't they have grabbed that wealth for their anti-American treasury?" Riley whirled around with more speed and quickness of response than I had dared to hope for. His eyes bored into me with a searching intensity. "Anton," he said quietly, "you may be smarter about that than even you know." He whirled back to the little sacristy window and put his hand on the catch, as if he were trying to remember whether it had been open or whether in an instinctive, thoughtless gesture he had unlocked it. Father Tierney, the generous fool, spoke up. "You unlatched it," he said. "It was locked." Sergeant Riley muttered a low thanks, and I could imagine the chain of reasoning that was linked in his mind. Was Father Tierney a guiltless man who could afford to throw aside a clue pointing to a possible real murderer? Or was he a clever man who knew that this statement would make him, however guilty he might be, seem innocent? For the window led directly toward a back stairs that led up into the Bund Hall, and if it had been open, it would have been an easy step from the sacristy into the open air, and thence to the hall, with jewels that the Bund would think better in their hands than in the hands of a Russian countess. Only, as the priest had foolishly stated, the window had been locked, and... "So they got your jewels, didn't they?" I think we must have all whirled with a single mechanical impulse, and I think we were all equally astonished. For framed, almost silhouetted in the doorway, was a woman. At first glance I didn't recognize her. Then a second look brought back straggling memories of the social service clinic down the street, the Halsted Center, of this woman who ruled it and coursed the district like some lean hunting dog, of children running away when she appeared, and polite Italians standing in the doorway, listening as she talked to them in a flow of eager, passionate words that might have made the men among them reach for a stiletto had they more than half understood. For she would fling the asset of her speech on their religion, offering the Center as a substitute for the Church. She stood now in the doorway, lean, slightly dishevelled, her suit not quite fitting, her hair not quite neat, the faint suggestion that she might be not quite clean. Her eyes, I could not help thinking, seemed not quite normal. But Riley had seized on a fact that in a moment we would all surely have noticed. "How did you happen to know anything about the jewels?" The woman faced him and drew her lips into a thin line, savage in her contempt for him, writhing in her hate for the priest. She disregarded his question. "This church," she waved into the semi-darkness, "once belonged to my Center. Do you think I should have let them sell it if I had known it was for the Mass and that idolatry?" She included the icons in a gesture that was dramatically crammed with hate. "Well, I asked her for those jewels. I told her what good they would do. The children, they would save them from the streets. The superstitions they would sweep from human minds. The mothers crushed under the millstone of childbearing, to whom they would give freedom. I asked her for even a part of them, to pawn for the services of another nurse, to sell to buy a bed, a swing for the playground, a year's service from a doctor. But she gave them to the Church! The Church!" She wrapped the word with a blanket of venom that made it seem the most awful of nouns. She looked at the priest. "And now they've stolen them, these jewels, if you didn't steal them yourself." She looked at the sergeant, through eyes narrowing to a glinting squint. "I'm glad. They might have served humanity. The God to whom they were given hadn't the strength to protect them from the thieves who wanted them more than he did." As suddenly as she had come, she swung away from the door and out into the aisle of the church. The hard leather of her low shoes clicked savagely staccato messages of hatred, revenge, gratified resentment. I half expected Sergeant Riley to spring down the aisle after her. Instead, he simply leaned against the door jamb and watched her as she went down the aisle. "Who's that Queen of the May?" he asked of nobody in particular. Again Father Martin spoke in answer. "Her full name, I think, is Maud Bowling Whitecliffe. She runs, and, I rather think, owns the Halsted Center. She's a thorn in the side of the churches, all of them. But how she knew—" Riley lifted a finger to a plain-clothes man who had been standing against the far wall of the church. "Tail her," he said briefly. But even as he did and the man obediently stepped forward, the woman popped back into the church and almost screamed at Riley across the brief distance. "Of course you'll have me followed. How did I know about the jewels, eh? Well, keep your men busy with someone who's guilty. And if I had the jewels, do you think I'd be fool enough to let you find them, when I know what they could do for me and my work?" Again she disappeared, and Riley held the detective in check with a flick of his finger. "Skip it," he said quietly. "When we want her, we'll find her easily enough. Miss Whitecliffe, I suppose?" "She claims she was never married," said Father Tierney. "Isn't some man lucky?" mused Riley without the slightest trace of humor in his voice. The police had finished their search of the church, and a uniformed sergeant came back to report. "Nothing we can make of it," he said briefly. "Too many fingerprints to make any of them important." "We'll check it all at the station," said Riley, and the police, after posting guards, disappeared. Then Riley turned toward Father Tierney and the two of us. "Of course you are in a way material witnesses. I must ask you all to hold yourselves ready." And through the street door of the little church came the sudden roar of voices, angry voices, voices suited for brawls and battlefields and the raiding of small Jewish shops. Riley walked out into the sanctuary and peered out. The clamor swelled, and above it I could distinguish the voice of an Irish policeman repeating his orders that nobody, no, not a God-blessed soul, was going to get in without a written official order. Riley lifted his hand commandingly. "Let him in, O'Flanagan," he cried, and the officer resentfully stepped aside. For a moment I felt myself transported back to the Berlin I had seen and pitied last summer. For down the aisle of the church swung in military fashion a tall man wearing riding breeches and leather putts and a brown shirt, across which was fastened a snug sand-brown belt. On his dark head was a quasi-military cap marked with a swastika. Riley moved forward a step so that he held the man at the altar rail. Back of him came two associates dressed in almost the same uniform, young, grim-looking fellows for all the world cut from the same goods that had served for the making of storm-troopers. I shook myself violently. No, this wasn't Berlin or Munich. It was Chicago and America in dirty old Blue Island Avenue. But the man was speaking. "Are you the officer in charge of this case?" Riley answered with a monosyllable that was like a blow. "Aye," said the man in uniform, as if his name should open doors in the sides of mountains and lay pathways to the stars. "And Franz Schwartz. These are my lieutenants." I could feel rather than see Riley's left eyebrow lift a trifle. "Lieutenants?" He picked up the word and held it as he would a beetle between thumb and forefinger. "I know only lieutenants who wear the army or navy or police or fire uniforms. What sort of lieutenants are these? And what kind of a fancy dress rig is that you've got on?" Schwartz put his polished right boot upon the altar rail. For a moment I thought Riley was going to kick it down. Instead he insultingly lifted his own right shoe to an identical position, and the two men stood facing each other without any pretense at the common decencies. "I think," said the bund leader, "that you will come to know these uniforms very well as time goes on. That's not, however, the reason I am here. To instruct you in the ways of the swastika bund. There's been a murder and an important theft." Riley gave no answer, no hint that an answer was expected of him. "We feel that it is the duty of all decent Americans who hate the slimy communists and the dirty Jews who finance them to help in a case of this kind. Father Tierney there is a friend of mine." I must admit that I was amazed. I had never dreamed that Father Mart had the slightest connection with these professional ruffians. Then, when I saw the startled look on his face, I knew that he too was amazed, so I waited for an explanation. Riley, without removing his foot or dropping his insulting attitude, turned toward the priest. "Is this," he said, indicating the bund leader with a deliberately crude jerk of his thumb, "a friend of yours?" Father Tierney shook a positive head. "I have seen him on the streets sometimes when he was going to his meetings, but I've never spoken to him in my life." Riley swung insolently back to meet the bund leader eye to eye. "Father Tierney is too much of a gentleman to say what I'll state plainly, that you're clearly a liar." Schwartz shook that off with a twist of his shoulders. "Any man who hates the filthy Bolshevists as he does, who is preparing to go back to Russia, as I know he is, and undermine their power, is a friend of mine and of my men of the Bund." Riley laughed shortly. "I am afraid, Father Tierney, that you are more picked upon than picking. Fortunately, one can always decline an offer of friendship." Before Father Tierney could answer, Schwartz lifted his hand in a gesture that surprisingly commanded obedience. "Father Tierney may not know it, but he has for the past 2 weeks been getting envelopes from me and my Bund associates. We naturally signed our names as private individuals, not as Bund members. But I am proud now, Father, to be able to admit to our small contributions to your cause and your church." From the flush that again rose to Father Tierney's face, I knew that he must have been getting the envelopes and the money. They had seemed so innocent. Now they proved so terrible a handicap. Riley kept shifting his gaze between the two men, and he too clearly realized that the priest had been tricked into accepting the Bund's money. But Schwartz was talking again in that deep, rumbling, authoritative voice of his. "Sergeant, I place my men at your disposal to help you solve this crime." Riley looked his blank refusal. "I rather fancy, Schwartz, that the recognized and official police force of the city can attend to matters of this kind, without help from fake soldiers, cheap imitations of European bullies." Schwartz smiled grimly. Nevertheless, my men will be on the watch." He took his foot from the altar rail and swung in military fashion toward the priest. "Sir, if you had stolen the jewels yourself, I should not have blamed you. Any means you took to help beat back these slimy communists, I should consider honorable and noble. So, if you took Russian jewels to win back Russian people to decency and justice—" Riley's voice cut like a swung scimitar across the sentence. "I suppose, Schwartz, that you're not too dull to know what you are saying." "Perfectly." "And if you think it right for this priest to murder and steal for his cause, maybe you think it would be right for your blunders to murder and steal for your cause." Schwartz met his inquisition without flinching. "Frankly, murder and theft are mere words when applied to the enemies of our cause or the goods of those who corrupt the world with their filthy teachings and practice. Does that answer your question?" Riley nodded slowly. "More than adequately." He placed his hand in an unexpected grip on the bun leader's shoulder. Somehow, with a hardly perceptible shrug, Schwartz tossed off the sergeant's hand. "I dislike drama," he said. "And others," the detective added. Schwartz looked over the head of the detective and straight at the priest. "Again I say, Father Tierney, we of the Bund are your friends." He gutturaled a deep command. The lieutenants clicked their heels, stepped smartly aside, and he strode down the aisle of the church with the two men swinging in military precision behind him. "Well," said Riley quietly, and then he grinned when the Irish patrolman at the door took a symbolic kick at the retreating forms of the Bunders. But Riley's face grew instantly serious. "Father, you're not too lucky in your friends." It was Carl who used this sentence as a cue line. "Well, if having us for friends is lucky," he said in a voice that he kept deliberately emotionless, "then you're in the luck. I know that Sergeant Riley would laugh at the idea of your having anything to do with the whole miserable business. As for Pierre here, and myself, well, being musicians of a sort, we practically have all the time in the world. I've always wanted to be an amateur detective." "Well, what's a Sherlock without his Dr. Watson?" I demanded. Riley looked very official. So official that we all knew he was posturing. "Very irregular. We professional dicks object to amateur meddlers." He grinned again. "I've a great gift, though, for looking the other way. So—" Serious again. "But, Father Tierney, I shall have to ask your word of honor that you will stay where I can reach you." And as we stood together, a little huddle in the center of the dim sanctuary, I knew that a pact had been formed. The chase was on, but where was a clear scent? And where would it lead? End of Chapter 2. Recording by Maria Therese.